This is a story from the books of Enoch, specifically First Enoch. And it is fascinating. It has transgressed time. It has a foothold in many different facets of sci-fi, religious history, film, TV. The Anunnaki, the idea of Prometheus, the bringer of light that actually causes humanity's downfall. We're going to go through all the details, everything you need to know about the Watchers. So let's dive in. Okay, these are heavenly beings that are mentioned in the ancient book of Enoch. They were sent to help guide humanity, but instead cause its downfall. They share a forbidden knowledge that changes history of the human race, and this knowledge brings both progress and destruction to the world. And the reason why this is not included in the Bible, well, we'll discuss, okay? So, according to the Book of Enoch, this was an ancient Jewish text from around 300 BC. The Watchers were not ordinary angels, okay? They were a special group chosen by God for a unique mission, all right, to watch over humanity in its early days. Their job is important, but particular, okay? They have to observe, guide, and protect the human race as it took its first steps into the world. At this time, again, according to the Book of Enoch, people had barely begun to discover what they could do. Life was simple, but it was hard to predict, right? Filled with both beauty, but also struggle, and communities were starting to form. But staying alive felt like fighting against nature itself. And again, I'm fascinated by these types of texts, not because I believe them. I don't read the Book of Enoch and think like, oh, this is actual historical literature, but it does give you an insight into some of the ideas and theories about spirituality and divinity that the, Jewish people or some specific sects of Judaism had in this time. So God, Hashem, in his wisdom, decides to give the Watchers, this specific group of angels, a holy task. They weren't supposed to directly interfere with humanity, but to just quietly guide people and make sure that humanity grew according to God's plan. And the Watchers, these were amazing beings. They were angels with wisdom and power, chosen because they were disciplined and devoted to God. They were meant to be guardians, an invisible barrier between the heavenly world and the human world. From their position in the heavens, they watched humanity's happiness and their sadness and, our strengths, our weaknesses. And humanity, again, it's not perfect, right? We already had the fall, according to the book of Genesis, but it had something special, this untapped potential that even fascinated the angels. But what happens when those who are supposed to guide humanity starts to question their own duty? What if their interest turns into something forbidden, something dark, perhaps evil? And this is where the story of the Watchers takes a turn. Everything you need to know about how the Watchers should have acted is in the name. They were supposed to watch, but they didn't just watch, they acted, and their actions would shake the very foundation of creation. It started with curiosity, maybe even like an admiration, and soon this admiration turned into something more dangerous. The beauty of human life, with complicated emotions, and yes, of course, the appeal of human women proved too much for some of them. One angel, Semyaza, couldn't resist. He saw something amazing in humanity, something wild, but again, full of potential. And he knew the dangers, right? This kind of contact with humanity was forbidden, but still, he couldn't ignore what he wanted. So he came up with a plan. He was going to fall from grace, and he wasn't going to fall alone. Semyaza gathered others, convincing them to make a promise of rebellion, and 200 of these Watchers, 200 angels, agreed to leave their heavenly jobs, coming down to earth to act on their earthly desires, no matter the cost. And this is where everything changes, right? This is the beginning of something much bigger, something that would affect all of the development of humanity. The story of the Watchers is far from over, but what they did wasn't just betrayal. It might have been the start of a new chapter in human history. So the Watchers didn't come to Earth empty-handed also. They brought gifts, powerful, life-changing knowledge that pushed humanity forward in ways that we never could have imagined. But as history has shown, knowledge can be both helpful and hurtful. What the Watchers gave us helped build civilization, but it also brings chaos. So let's start with Azazel. Among the 200 Watchers or angels, his name stands out, and for good reason. Azazel taught humanity metallurgy, showing us how to make weapons from iron and bronze. And this was a lesson in control and power. So with weapons, humans no longer needed to depend on just physical strength or large numbers. Power could now be held by those who controlled the tools of war. As a result, the battles become bloodier and fights get worse, and tribes battle for land and resources and revenge. The weapons bring power, but it also creates chaos and violence. But Azazel doesn't stop there. He also reveals the secrets of decoration and beauty. Things like jewelry, makeup, other symbols of beauty became common. And what might seem, harmless in today's time was in ancient times something completely new. And these gifts create vanity and desire, and they cause envy and temptation. And the Watchers had shown humanity a world where appearance could be a weapon just as dangerous as, any cannon or gun. So while Azazel shaped Earth's physical tools, another Watcher, known as Kokabel, turned humanity's eyes to the heavens. He taught us astrology, the study of stars, and the secrets of how these celestial bodies move. And to early humans, this is life-changing, right? The heavens, once an unknowable space, now becomes a cosmic map that can predict seasons and help navigation and find distant lands and even, maybe, predict future events. But with this knowledge comes another temptation, the desire to control the future. So Armaros taught the art of spells and curses, introducing humanity to the world of magic. And these teachings opened doors to control the natural world and other people. And magic, once hidden in the shadows, now becomes a tool for those seeking power. At first, these gifts seem like blessings, right? You can navigate, you can build, weapons, you can protect yourself. And farming improves and societies become more organized. Humanity begins to take control of its environment. The Watchers' knowledge built the foundation for, these early civilizations, but the progress comes at a cost. The weapons lead to war, vanity causes corruption, magic and astrology, once tools of wonder, become sources for fear and manipulation. But it gets even crazier. In the book of Enoch, it is described how the worst result of the Watchers' rebellion was the creation of the Nephilim. Again, this is something that is in sort of apocryphal gospels or Gnostic gospels, that, books that are around the time of many of the books we know from the Bible, but are not included in the biblical canon. But reference to the Nephilim does exist in the biblical canon. But in this specific instance, this is from the book of Enoch, which is not included, but it does share the same word, which is very interesting. The Nephilim were mixed beings. In the book of Enoch, it's described as being born from forbidden relationships between angels and humans, and they were giants in every way. They had huge physical size, and it was matched only by their massive appetites for food and power and destruction. And the book of Enoch describes how the Nephilim used up Earth's resources, turning this farmland into these empty wastelands. And their presence upset the balance of nature itself, leaving destruction basically everywhere that they went. And it wasn't just the Nephilim's physical strength that scared humanity, it was their moral evil, right? The Nephilim were said to have gotten their worst qualities from both their angel and human parents. So pride, greed, a hunger for control, and they were cruel rulers, and their reign of terror brought humanity to the edge of disaster. And the book of Enoch, again, goes on to share that as humanity fell into chaos, heaven could no longer stay silent. The Watchers' rebellion had not only corrupted the earth, but it also went against the very order of God's creation in its own right. Their gifts had brought war and greed and destruction, and the children of these Watchers, the Nephilim, used up the world's resources and spread violence across the land. And the earth suffered under the weight of their sins, and God's judgment was on its way. So the book of Enoch tells us that God, seeing the destruction caused by the Watchers and their children, he, called upon his most powerful archangels to step in. Yeah, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel. And they were given the jobs of restoring balance. And their mission is pretty clear. Punish the Watchers, cleanse the earth, and make sure that such a rebellion never happens again. So what do? The boys roll in 4 deep. They got to find Azazel. This is the guy that teaches metallurgy. And as the main cause of humanity's corruption, the secret of weapons and vanity and forbidden knowledge, his punishment is quick but harsh. He's tied up hand and foot, thrown into a dark, rocky pit beneath the earth. The archangels then cover him in sharp stones, and they seal him into an eternal prison. Now, again, this is very, emblematic of like Hercules, where you have these sort of powerful beasts that are, sent under the earth. In Islam, you have the idea of Yajuj and Majuj that are, basically hidden in the earth somewhere, waiting to come out. And once again, in the book of Enoch, you have similar themes that, like I've said before, sort of transgress time. And as we see with Azazel, he's sent under the earth where he will remain blinded by darkness until the day of judgment when he would face his final fate. Semyaza, the leader of the Watchers, just as guilty. though he had not shared necessarily as much knowledge as some of the other angels. He planned the rebellion in the first place, and his fellow angels, he basically brought them into sin. So Semyaza was thrown into the abyss alongside the other watchers. He's tied up in chains and basically banished beneath the mountains of the earth. It's said in the book of Enoch, their cries of despair echoed through the earth as they waited for divine punishment. But the Watchers' punishment wasn't the end of the cleansing, right? You still have these Nephilim, these monster-like hybrid things born from these forbidden unions with, these evil, rebellious angels and our hot-ass human women. And they posed a greater threat, right? Their existence is an insult to the natural order. They're too powerful and too many to be defeated by human hands. They were swept away in the Great Flood. This catastrophic event, recorded not only in the book of Enoch, but basically every single culture around the world, as well as the book of Genesis, was a reset, a divine act to wash away the sins of the Watchers and their creation. And the flood, as it's known in Christianity, marks the end of an era. The earth was cleansed, but the scars of the Watchers' rebellion still remains. Their influence in the knowledge that they had shared and the ruins of civilization that they had corrupted and the myths and the legends that would be passed down through generations still persists. But what happens to the Watchers themselves? The book of Enoch tells us that they're imprisoned under the earth, trapped in darkness and suffering. These angelic beings, once respected as, God's most formidable guardians, were now sentenced to an eternity of pain, but the story doesn't end there. Some traditions suggest that the Watchers' imprisonment wasn't meant to last forever. The book of Enoch, specifically First Enoch, hints at a final judgment, a time where the Watchers would be brought out of their prisons to face God's final verdict. Their fate, like their story, who knows? Were they truly defeated, or does their influence still affect us through time? This depends on who you ask. The Watchers' fall serves as a kind of a warning story about the dangers of going against divine law and the results of using knowledge without wisdom. But it also raises questions about humanity itself, right? If the Watchers were punished for their rebellion, what does that say about the knowledge that they left behind? Even more frightening is the thought that the Watchers' story might not be over. Now, again, only some people on Earth really look at the book of Enoch as a true tale of creation. And so some interpretations, their imprisonment beneath the earth is not a final defeat, but a pause, and that perhaps one day they will return. And if they did, what would they find, right? A humanity that potentially reached its potential, or one that repeated the very mistakes that they started. And what's interesting about the Watchers is that, we talked about some of them, right? Semyaza, Azazel, Kokabel, and Oromos, but they were not the only guardians of the heavens who disappeared from history. Hidden within different ancient texts and old stories are stories of other Watchers, though, a little bit less known, or equally as important.